The glorious 1st of June, a battle in which the losing side suffers 6 ships of the line to be captured, a ship of the line sunk, roughly 4,000 killed and wounded, and a further 3,000 captured. And yet, still, despite its often quoted name as the glorious 1st of June, quite regularly, it is disputed as to whether or not it's actually a victory. Why? Well, ultimately, we're going to go through this, and you'll get the idea that it boils down to one little tiny issue. A very simple issue. Lord Howe won a battle. He achieved a great tactical victory. And strategically, after this battle, the Royal Navy pretty much dominated the sea for the rest of the War of First Coalition. However, the immediate strategic goal of intercepting the French grain convoy failed. But let's be honest, it failed only in the extent that they survived. They had to go into the Atlantic ports, and most of the grain did not reach Paris anyway, but we'll get into that at the end. The grain convoy got through, so it was considered a strategic failure. The fact that the French fleet artists don't really like to come out, the fact that this battle cements the idea not only of breaking the line, but of achieving a total victory, and sets a path which will lead to Trafalgar. The Battle of Trafalgar. In just, 11 years' time. It doesn't matter. What matters is this does not achieve the great, overwhelming strategic and tactical victory desired at the time. So yes, we call this the glorious 1st of June. Yes, it is actually about 3 battles, a couple of smaller battles, and then the main one on the 1st of June. Yes, it is a huge multi-week long campaign. Yes, it is a culmination where one of the officers in charge of his fleet spends 6 days. 6 days. This is a man who is nearly 70. Spends 6 days on his flag deck with nothing but a chair to rest on. Usually pacing. Usually watching what's going on. Listening to all the information. 6 days. Not sleeping. Not leaving the deck. So he's constantly there to lead, command, and control his force. And yet still, for some, this battle is not enough. On the 28th of May, Baker noted, and this comes from Peter Hoare's wonderful book, The Habit of Victory. Cleared the decks for action, stowed our hammocks on the tops, and got up in a sufficiency of powder and shot of all sorts and sizes. The signal was made to tack in succession, but we missed stays on account of the heavy seas. The whole fleet kept together for the night, and carried as much sail as so stormy a night would permit us, and every man remained at his quarters. Howe nearly succeeded on the 29th of May, but appears to have misjudged the timing of attack. At daylight saw the enemy's fleet to windward, and much nearer to us than the day before. The French pointed their guns very high, which did a good deal of execution about our rigging, but we fired chiefly at their hulls, as we thought it best. On breaking their line, we gave 3 cheers, and were exposed to a smart and quick carronading from the whole of the French line, which we kept up with an uncommon spirit. And the men behaved uncommonly well, nor did any accident happen from powder. But everything on board went on with great regularity. We kept on up a fine fire until upon them till 3 o'clock, when, having passed the whole of their line and received the fire of almost all their ships, with very few on our side to assist us, we hauled off. And in the joy that is the plurality of naval battle, it was this manoeuvre which lost contact with the French, but also gained the weather gauge for Howe. So far, the battle had been fought in very lumpy seas, which had made movement very difficult, but still Orion's damage had to be repaired. So, thanks again to having the weather gauge and to being able to, therefore, manoeuvre yourself with control, with understanding the weather. How do I put this politely? Having the weather gauge puts you upwind. This enables you to anticipate manoeuvres far better. As if you're upwind, you can choose when to come down to attack with the wind behind you, and you have the wind behind you to assist in your attack. So you actually can do a far more decisive manoeuvre than if you are, as was earlier, when he'd been attacking and trying to bring them to action on the 29th and on the 28th, he'd been fighting against the wind. Fighting against the wind makes life difficult. Makes life mean and hard if you're a sailing ship. Shameless book plug. This video will be coming out on, I think it's the 3rd of June. Yes. It's the 3rd of June. And so I am landing in Australia today. I would not have made it to Australia without you. Without your support. Without the support of people who've managed to buy the book. Without the support of the people who watch the videos on this channel. The people who join this, who subscribe to the channel, who join this channel. Without the people who support on Patreon. Without the people who've gone to Shipshape, which you should find a link to down below. And the Australia trip. Without it, none of this would be possible. So thank you. We're always... It's one of those things, it always feels kind of weird to say, thank you for the money you've given me. We need more money still. But we do. Because it's an ongoing thing. And the costs are ongoing. The Australia trip is going to be great. It's going to be amazing to do all the naval history out there. And to be able to bring you that naval history. But it's also a month away from work. A month away from, well, when I say from work, from normal teaching, the normal things I do to bring in money, etc. So I'm going to be even more exposed. There again, I'm not so worried about it because, as you all know, thanks to all of you, I have actually survived when university employers have forgotten to pay, or rather not paid, for a month or so. So I'm hoping I'll do okay, and hoping I'll be okay, and that's all thanks to you. So thank you for your support, and thank you for buying the book. Really nice of you. So the 1st of June is Admiral Howe's greatest battle. And that's not me being... That's not me highfalutin it at all. This is a man who fought in many amazing battles. You know, his basic years of service, he fought in the War of the Austrian Succession, the Jacobite Rising of 1745, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, and of course the French Revolutionary Wars. He managed to receive both the Knight of the Order of the Garter, which is a fairly big thing being made a Knight of the Order of the Garter, That's that outranks quite a few other orders. In fact, that's pretty much the most senior order of chivalry. And he received the Naval Gold Medal. Now, this was awarded between 1793 and 1815 to senior officers of the Royal Navy for specified actions. And he got a large Naval Gold Medal. Yeah. He also ended up retiring an Admiral of the Fleet, so he never really got to retire. He served 1740 to 1799. He lived 1726 to 1799. He died age 73. So, in 1794, he is 68 years old. He's been at sea for 54 years of his life. He joined at 14. By this point in his life, he has spent more time at sea than he has ashore. He doesn't just know the sea, he's of the sea. And this, when you talk about someone like this, someone who has conducted the successful relief of the Great Siege of Gibraltar, who was a captain in the Battle of Quiberon Bay. When you talk about a battle as being his greatest battle, you are making a big statement. He was born in Albemarle Street, London, second son of Emmanuel Howe, the second Viscount Howe, who died as governor of Barbados in 1735, and his mum was Charlotte, daughter of Baroness von Klesmag and Countess of Darlington, the half-sister of George I. He was educated at Eton College. Yes, Eton. Consider what it's known for today. Lord Howe is what it was known for a good few years, because, trust me, Lord Howe gave him a reputation. The names of the ships he commanded and the fleets he commanded. Well, he had HMS Baltimore, HMS Triton, HMS Ripon, HMS Cornwall, yay! HMS Glory, HMS Dolphin, HMS Dunkirk, HMS Magnum, HMS Princess Amelia, the Mediterranean Fleet, the North American Station, and the Channel Fleet. And again, this is his greatest battle. And it's important for several reasons. One, it is 25 Royal Navy ships a line versus 26 French ships a line. Now, as you see when we look at the order of battle, things aren't necessarily that simply defined, and there are issues the French are having, but yep. There are still... I think one of the things you have to consider this battle, I'm going to say this now before I get into it. Please, no one think I'm going to say at any point the French won this battle. Because I realise there is some ambiguity because of the strategic win of getting the convoy to shore, but I don't think that means you won a battle. If the convoy had got to the ports closer to Paris, I had got up the Channel rather than going into the Atlantic ports, where they were aiming for, so they could have actually delivered the food to Paris in time, then I would consider that a strategic win. But they are forced into the Atlantic ports, which means the food doesn't get to Paris in time and spoils. So, at worst, you call it a strategic draw and a tactical win. But then you sort of consider, well, they've just lost 7 ships of the line, 6 captured, 1 sunk, and roughly 7,000 naval personnel for a convoy that doesn't get where it needs to go to deliver the supplies where it needs to be delivered. You can spin it as the Britain doesn't get the victory they want, but they certainly get a victory. I don't think you can spin it as a French victory, so I'm not sure how, on some scenarios, like if you look at Wikipedia, etc., they have result things like sea aftermath. I don't like to do it as a mathematical thing, but it's kind of a large loss of personnel and everything else for your operational capabilities. And it's basically after this battle that the British are able to conduct the blockade for the rest of the war. So they gain control of the sea in this battle. But you do get press from both sides trying to claim victory, but it's rather interesting to try and hear someone go, "We got the convoy!" to the wrong ports. "But we got the convoy in!" to the wrong ports. "So we got no food in Paris, but we got the convoy in." Anyway, the War of the First Coalition. It's interesting as wars go. There is a dispute over exactly how it starts. Usually we start off with, well, France deciding that they were going to invade Austria and Prussia and have an argument with both of them. And so you end up with fronts in both Italy and Germany. Always sensible. And that's in 1792. And then in 1793, they decide, you know what, we're having enough fun. We're not having enough fun. We need to have more. So what we'll do is the Republican-held forts at Brest in Brittany decided to fire on a brig, HMS Childers. Now, there is a small issue with that. And I say there's a small issue, in that is always used as the example of the first time a French fort fires on a British warship. However, smaller British warships we know had been doing a lot of mapping off the coast of France already by this point, in preparation for a potential war, because it was felt that one was coming. And whilst this is before the execution of King Louis XVI, it's been the British have close enough relationships with Prussia and Austria, and remember the British have a habit of hiring Prussia to be their army on the continent, and considering the British ruling family at the time, well, let's put it this way. It wasn't without provocation on both sides, but I wouldn't be surprised in some of the accounts I've read, both fictional, which were well researched, and actual accounts from time periods from some of the authors writing home from those little ships, that there might have already been firings on boats which may not have been describing British flags while they were getting people on and off the shore of France. Britain was very keen on extracting émigré officers of suitable capabilities, but also, and this was just as important, French naval constructors. Okay? The War of the First Coalition and the period before it is basically the first time this happens on a mass scale. But one of the things you notice about a lot of the people who managed to get out of France to England and to United Kingdom, whereas previously when Louis XIV had decided that he was no longer going to allow Protestants to serve in his navy, and that sent a whole load of personnel off to the Royal Navy. Thank you, we'll take them. A few other navies benefited from those very, very skilled personnel turning up, but the Royal Navy specifically had quite a leavening of them. They took the better ones, and they got rid of some of their less capable officers and replaced them with them. Well, to be honest, this was again another opportunity, but this time the Royal Navy actually went on a campaign of acquisition. And a large number of French naval architects turn up in the UK. And there's a very interesting policy attached to them. They are there to provide their information on how they've been constructing ships, but they are still very much put under the leadership of British constructors. And that is almost where you start to get the new generation of ships that come through in the 1790s come from. Yes, the British are capturing French ships, but they have the people who built them already working in their yards. Also helps with when you need to repair those ships and get them back into fighting trim if you have the people who built and designed them on staff. Makes things easier. So the war starts. And honestly, for the British getting involved in 1793, it's a year of interesting activities, but rather indiscreet activities. There are actions in Chesapeake Bay, there are actions around the world, and of course there is Sir Sidney Smith going off and doing all sorts of... Let's just leave Smith and the various things he's doing to a whole other video. That man is a one-man war zone. He's an entire faction in and of himself. But the point is, the war keeps going on, and there's a siege of Toulon going on. And that is a very big clash. Because whilst it's a French Republican victory, nine ships of the line are scuttled in harbour. 4 ships of the line, 7 frigates and 5 corvettes are captured and taken away by the British. And it's a further dividing line in the French Navy, because the thing is, Toulon had been a French naval port for the Mediterranean. It was the naval port for them in the Mediterranean, and it was also one of their better ports. Think about it. From the perspective of France, it's your direct access to the Mediterranean. You pretty much have to have almost 3 navies if you're France. You need to have a Channel squadron to deal with your issues going in the Channel. You need to have an Atlantic squadron to deal with your issues going on around the world and your rest of the world links. And you need to have a Mediterranean squadron. And the geography of France works that these fleets can not really support each other. Yes, in theory the Channel and the Atlantic Squadron can support each other, but the trouble is the way the currents and things go, if the Atlantic Squadron spends too much time in the Channel, it ain't going to be defending your Atlantic coast. And if the Channel Squadron comes out to support the Atlantic Squadron, it's going to have a tough time getting in, and there's going to be a Royal Navy Channel Squadron waiting to go, hello, we hear you came out of port and sailed in the wrong direction, and we're sitting between you and your port. This is fun. So you've gone out into the Atlantic, you got beaten up by the storms, and now you're trying to get home past us. We like these odds. But also, not everything's going for the Royal Navy's way. Nothing is, in fact, nothing ever does always go the Royal Navy's way. There are shortages of recruitment, especially in terms of Royal Marines. And therefore, you have things like, in Howe's fleet alone, you have 2 army regiments featured. You have the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey, who are one of the ancestors of the Princess of Wales Royal Regiment. And the 29th Worcester Regiment of Foot, who are, well, there is a slightly more interesting history to try and work out where they exactly are today. Principally, we're going with the Mercian Regiment, because that's principally where they seem to have ended up. But whereas the Queen's Royal Regiment you can basically trace it very quickly because it only ceased to exist in 1959. The 29th Worcester Regiment of Foot ceased to exist in 1698, brought back in 1702, ceased to exist again in 1881, and then there's sort of the Worcester Regiment stood up till 1970, and then the Mercian Regiment is stood up in 2007, and yeah, there's some interesting times in between 1970 to 2007. So these regiments have a storied history. They do. They were being used as Marines because they were shorter Marines and they needed troops. If you're going to do boarding actions, you need soldiers. Why? Well, if you think about it in terms of boarding action, what do you have to control? Deck. And whilst your sailors are going to be great for taking the rigging and great for fighting below the deck, on top of the deck you need to fight it almost like you would fight a land battle. You need to be able to form rank, you need to be able to advance as a drill. And frankly, you don't have time for your sailors to pick up those skills whilst also doing all the constant duties of keeping the ropes and everything else going in a ship. You've barely enough time to... You will teach them cutlass drill, but you've barely enough time. So this is where you need those troops. They're also good for discipline aboard the ship, to have an extra group of personnel who are separate from the sailors, in case you need them, but that's less of a thing. It's really less of a thing than the fighting ship-to-ship actions, and the potential of going ashore in doing land operations. But this did cause an interesting dispute over pay of officers, because the pay scales for Marines was different than the pay scales for soldiers. And also, of course, at certain points in history, naval officers have occasionally drawn double pay by being their own captain of the Marines. It's a nice little bit of extra money. You know, never be short in trying to get some extra dough. So, here are your commanders. You have Richard Howe, 1st Earl Howe, this gentleman. He looks like he's spent 54 years at sea, doesn't he? He really does. And then we have Louis Thomas Villert de Joyce. I've already given you a bit of an introduction to Howe, the 68-year-old grizzled veteran who had, well, as I said, fought his way for the Royal Navy for 54 years by this point. So let's look at his opponent. Villert de Joyce was not happy to be in charge, but he was in charge, and he took his pride and his nation seriously, even if it wasn't the nation he had originally started to join and serve. He had been unable to enter the elite naval schools when he was young. He was, after all, only the son of a fiscal officer. He entered the Navy as a volunteer in 1768. He was promoted to lieutenant in 1773. He served as a lieutenant on the 32-gun frigate Atlante in the Indian Ocean, and in 1778, unemployed in Pondicherry, he volunteered his services to Governor de Belcom during the siege of Pondicherry, earning the rank of Captain de Brulot. He commanded a fireship, the Pulversetter, in Suffren's fleet in 1781. He served under Suffren, who made him his aide in 1782, and he is later transferred to the frigate Dauphine and became first officer on Brilliant in Suffren's squadron later on. At the Battle of Cuddalore in 1783, Suffren had given him command of the frigate Bellone. A few months later, he's appointed to the 20-gun corvette Naïd and ordered to sail to Madras and warn the French blockading squadron, which was composed of just 2 ships of the line and 2 frigates, of the imminent arrival of a superior British force. Unfortunately for Villert de Joyce, his first independent battle would set the tone for much of his career, because during this voyage he spotted the 64-gun HMS Scepter. It's a 64. They're never good when they're Royal Navy ones, under Captain Graves. Graves, well, how do I put this, was a very experienced captain, and as much as Villert de Joyce tried to escape, he was forced into battle and struck his colours after a 5-hour fight, which was very brave. When he surrendered his sword, Graves already told him, "Sir, you have given us a fairly beautiful frigate, but you made us pay dearly for her." Some historians, I don't know the phrase when some people say authors. There are some people who have written interesting books about the period, but some historians states that Graves returned to Villert his sword, and this would not be unusual, because whilst you could take the sword off a gentleman and he'd given you his sword, it was a sign of surrender, he'd given you a sword, quite often you'd return the sword to them, because that was the honourable thing to do. You only kept the sword if you really didn't trust them. And one of the things about Villert de Joyce is he's frankly Villert de Joyce is, he's not exactly untrustworthy. He's not exactly the best or most creative commander you're ever going to fight, but he is loyal, honourable, and will stand by his colours to the death. The trouble is, you go through his battles, and they don't always turn out that well for him. In fact, a lot of them turn out very badly for him. And that brings us to this command, because in this period he is a rear admiral. Let's put that in context. Howe? Lord Howe? Well, he is admiral. He is an admiral. He has vice admirals under his command. He has rear admirals below them, and he has captain commodores as well around. In contrast, Villard de Joyce, well, his fleet, he has Rear Admiral Bouvet in charge of the vanguard. Rear Admiral Villard de Joyce, is in charge of the main force, sometimes referred to as the battle corps. Not really sure on that. And then let's consider this. The rear guard, there is a dispute over who's in charge of it, but let's explain something. There is a first rate called the which is named the Republican. On that is a Rear Admiral Neely. I'm fairly certain if there's a Rear Admiral and a first rate in a squadron and the rest of the ships are third rates, the odds are the person in charge of it is Neely. And those particular historians who like to say we're not sure who's in charge of the rear guard, I think you're trying to make mountains out of molehills. That it's not that the specific signals do not necessarily mention Neely by name. They don't need to. There's only one Rear Admiral there, and it's the thing is there's 3 Rear Admirals in the entire French fleet in this battle. In the Royal Navy, in contrast, in their force, there are, and it's worthwhile considering this, there are 4 Rear Admirals, 2 Vice Admirals, and an Admiral. Now, you can sit there and go, well, surely it's more efficient. Think about the sheer body of experience that represents in comparison, leading the fleet. Think about the sheer body of knowledge that represents. Let's see, what happens if anything happens to Hood? Well, how's the Royal Navy going to be served? Well, there's Vice Admiral Thomas Graves there. Yes, the same gentleman who, as a captain, had taken the ship of Villard de Joyce. And if we look at the other officers down here, who's the other Vice Admiral? Oh, Sir Alexander Hood. So, how has Hood and Graves, 2 fairly decent, especially at this time, officers under his charge? Not necessarily always the best, but he's got Hood, and that tempers Graves quite nicely, and Graves tempers Hood, and Hood infuses Graves. His Rear Admirals, he's got Thomas Paisley, an officer who will go on to become a full admiral. Benjamin Caldwell, who goes on, of course, to have various arguments during the later parts of the Napoleonic Wars, but he's a good officer. George Boyer, who goes on to become a full admiral. He has Alan Gardner, who is one of those admirals who's a rather interesting officer in that he's commanding from a second rate, which is fine, rather than having got himself on a handle on a first rate. But Gardner famously didn't like to have a captain on his ship, preferring to have just more lieutenants, more senior lieutenants. Why do I say this? Because he liked to run his own ship. And this was a problem the whole way through his career as an admiral. So sometimes you will see no captain listed on his ship because the details are scarce. Usually you can find, and usually there will be a captain assigned, tries. Occasionally he gets paired with able officers. And when he does, it's always phrased like Howe tries to phrases with him before this campaign as, I have this young officer who's going to do well in future, but he needs training. I know you like to run your own ship. This officer will be a very good admiral. I need you to train him in not only running a ship, but also how to be an admiral. Because you like to run your ship, while he's thinking about how training as an admiral, you can play with running the ship. And when you need to be an admiral, he can run the ship, and you don't have to be doing both. Honestly, Gardner will go on to become one of the most famous frigate captains of the Royal Navy producers. He's just... and cruising admirals the Royal Navy produces, he loves to cruise. Prizes are definitely his thing. If you look at the captains, there's Thomas Pakenham here, there's Cuthbert Collingwood. There are names here which we will remember. Lord Howe's flag captains include Captain Sir Roger Curtis and Captain Sir Andrew Snape Douglas. For all those who thought Professor Snape comes from nowhere, there you go. One of his ancestors was one of the flag captains for Howe. I kid, of course, but it's a fun one to think about that the old wizard had a trainee wizard as one of his captains. And when I say trainee wizard, so Andrew Snape Douglas is a very distinguished Scottish Royal Naval officer who has his career cut short in 1797 at the age of 35. By that point, he'd already commanded HMS Roebuck, HMS Chatham, HMS Alcide, HMS Southampton, HMS Goliath, HMS Phaeton, HMS Queen Charlotte. He'd fought at the Siege of Charleston, the Glorious 1st of June, and the Battle of Groix. And yeah, he dies in 1797. He had from brain tumours, which were considered a result of his injuries at the Glorious 1st of June. Sad loss. Anyway, from the young wizard to the whole campaign. The campaign had been an interesting one, and it does not just start with a simple thing. The Atlantic campaign of 1794 was a month of activity where you have things happening around all over the world. It's kind of like a forerunner of the Trafalgar Saga and the Trafalgar campaign. I've done a video about this past, how all the events which go on which lead up to Trafalgar. How there is chasing of the fleets backwards and forwards, movements across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, back across the Atlantic, and the fact that Nelson actually overtakes the French. And how that affects things. Well, it's the same with this particular battle, the Glorious 1st of June. Both the French and the British, the French squadrons under Neely, the British squadrons under Montague, were commerce raiding in the Atlantic against enemy merchant shipping. The British had failed to find the main food convoy, but Neely, that's the French admiral, had managed to find the British convoy from Newfoundland and took 10 ships as prizes. Now the convoy from Newfoundland is of course bringing furs and fish. The 10 prizes he took included the 32-gun frigate HMS Castor, which was under command of Thomas Trowbridge. And so he would get to spend the entirety of the campaign aboard Neely's flagship, the Sans Perel. Now, Montague managed to meet with success later in the month, on the 15th of May, when he recaptured the merchant ships Neely had taken, along with the French corvette, the Mary Gouton, as well as, and this was perhaps more important, accurate intelligence on the direction and size of the French convoy, which Montague immediately passed to Howe. Neely found the convoy, after resuming his patrol in the Mid-Atlantic, from America a few days later, and transferred 2 of his ships to Vanstable's escort to augment the convoy's defences. He then returned to the East Atlantic to look for signs of British activity which might pose a threat to its passage. And this is again a fairly standard manoeuvre. But it's one of the things to think about, and we talk about in this order of battle. There are a lot more ships in the area than just those ones fighting. And all these ships have to be generated. So you've got the force structure that's going into generating them. All the infrastructure, all the systems going on. And this is one of the interesting things for the French. Because at this point in the war, they can generate this kind of concerted effort. But as time goes on, and their infrastructure and their institutional memory gets eroded, especially by, well, first you have the Republic, then you have the Directorate, and then you have Napoleonic Empire, and all the issues that are with those constant turmoil, and of course, as mentioned earlier, the British enticement of some of the very special people to go to Britain. And you have issues with generating ships turn up. However, Neely does something not even better. He doesn't just go and search for the British. He doesn't just add extra ships to the escort. He also detaches frigates to find Villeray-José. And they're important because they're carrying information about the convoy's location and speed, because it's the Villeray-José who's supposed to be securing them. Now, how? Well, he thinks I could be out hunting in the middle of the Atlantic for this convoy. But why do I want to go that far out when they know they're going to have to go through the Bay of Biscay? So that's where he is. He's cruising up and down the Bay of Biscay hoping to catch the convoy. Between the 5th and the 18th of May, he found nothing, and so returned to cover Brest. Now this is where he finds his first issue, because when he gets to Brest, he finds out that the French battle fleet has gone. Taking advantage of fog and the apparent absence of a major fleet, because this is before you have the inshore squadrons, which will make it seem like the fleet is always in the offing. And by the way, do not, and I say this with both my eyes if they're looking a bit red here, don't get double headbutted by dogs. You can end up looking like you have a black eye. Now, his ships actually passed within earshot of the British fleet, and they actually heard each other talking. But they didn't hear each other at a level they could discern the words, they just heard the murmur of the voices. And so the British thought they were other British ships, and the French thought they were other French ships. So there was no battle in the fog. The French admiral, Villeray-José, decided to trail Neely's squadron. His intention being to join up with both Neely and the convoy and combine forces, as with such superior numbers, he couldn't fail but to get the convoy to France safely. He then has extra bonus because he runs across a Dutch convoy of 53 vessels. Its escorts flee at the sight of the advance approaching French fleet, and so Villeray de Jose is able to attack the convoy and capture 20 merchant vessels. That's brilliant, but there's a small problem with that. If you spend your time capturing merchant vessels and doing all that and sending them back, that slows down your movement. And Howe's already behind you, and he's only a day behind you, and this is a fleet which is sailing hard. Now, Howe realised that Villeray's departure would take him directly across Admiral Montagu's planned route, and that should Montagu meet Villeray, the British squadron would be destroyed, because Montagu would fight. Because, in the nicest way, this is a Royal Navy which remembers the lessons of what happens when you don't fight. You get executed. So they fight. Howe is senior enough that he can ignore any accusations of him being less than brave. Montagu is not. And Howe knows this. So Howe is charging to try and meet up, because also, if he joins up with Montagu, then he'll have overwhelming force. Now, Villeray has actually helped Howe in many, many ways by capturing those Dutch ships. Because the very next day, after Villeray has captured them and sent them on their way, Howe recaptures 10 of them. He's forced to burn them, because crewing them with his own sailors would of course weaken his fleet. But prisoners from these ships, of course, give him a lot of information about what the French fleet was doing, how far ahead it was, and that it had been joined by an extra vessel from Neely's squadron, as well as several frigates. Howe also managed to receive information that Montagu was sailing to the southwest, and so was safely not in the way. Learning that Villeray was stronger than him, well, he decided to press on, hoping to Villeray to bring him to battle. Unfortunately, weather interferes. There are some strong winds, and the British fleet is driven southwards, and slowly has to work its way back to the north to find the French fleet again. But that detour did enable him to destroy a further 4 of Villeray's Dutch prizes, so, you know, small mercies. On the morning of the 25th of May, Howe's pursuit finally allowed him to spot the French ships of the line. Scouting frigate spotted them at 4 AM on the 25th of May. And here is the really, really stupid thing. Because if this ship had been able to signal, and had been confident in signalling the message of Howe, it wouldn't have merely told Howe where Villeray de Jose was, and de Jose could have chosen when he would engage and how he would engage. This ship instead decided to make off straight towards the direction of the French fleet, leaving behind an American merchant ship they'd been towing. This vessel, when captured by the British, reported that the French ship, which was sailing away as fast as its sails would carry it, was the Audacious of Neely's squadron. So the British burnt the American prize and pursued it. They overran and burnt 2 French corvettes, the 20-gun Republican and the 16-gun Inconnu, as well, on their route. And they continued their chase over the next 3 days until they find the rest of the French fleet. Unfortunately, they were to the south, and as mentioned earlier, they held weather gauge, and it's at this point you get the engagements on the 28th and 29th of May. Now, with his enemy, i.e. Villa de Droze's fleet, visible from his own flagship, in fact, Howe could see them, by 0630 hours, morning on 20th of May, he recalls his fleet. He basically brings in all his frigates. He isn't going to have the same thing happen to them as has happened to other ships. Basically piles on the sail is to try and attack rear, because they're scattered. In fact, when the Royal Navy sees them at some point, they might be the convoy them to look like a line, try and deceive them, because they are so scattered and so disorderly. But very soon they sort it themselves out, and to be honest, for the French, the problem is, I would say, a lack of experience and a lack of the officers who would ensure those sorts of things. You need both experienced staff officers, you need experienced officers at every single level. And they're basically promoting officers as fast as they can to fill the gaps which all the repeated turmoil has created. And there's only so far as those officers can actually fill those gaps. By about 4 hours later, the pursuit had made the Royal Navy's line also higgledy-piggledy. When he realised that Villa de Droze might use the weather gauge to try to escape, Howe sent a message to Thomas Pasley, one of his senior officers. Remember again, this is one of the things, Howe does have an advantage. He has a lot of senior officers. He has Rear Admiral Thomas Pasley in HMS Bellefonte, a nice third-rate 74, a very, very good ship, nicknamed the Billy Ruffian, the Bellefonte, and basically goes, Thomas, take every fast ship you can get your hands on and go after them. You are now a flying squadron. This squadron was actually faster than the vessels in either fleet, pretty much the majority of them, and so closed the French rear rapidly. Another 4 hours go past, and at 14:30 hours, so 8 hours after Howe had spotted the French fleet first, the first shots on the 28th of May are fired by HMS Russell. Now, this section on 28th of May are HMS Russell, a third-rate 74, under Captain John Willett Payne. Of course, HMS Bellefonte, under Rear Admiral Thomas Pasley, with Captain William Johnson Hope as flag captain. HMS Marlborough, commanded by Captain George Cranfield Berkeley. HMS Thunderer, commanded by Captain Albemarle Bertie. HMS Leviathan, commanded by Captain Lord Q. Seymour. And HMS Audacious, captained by William Parker. Sir William Parker, who would become an admiral and die in 1802, at the age of 59, in service. Although, let's be honest, he didn't have a good experience with St. John Jervis or Nelson. But we'll leave that to one side. The point is, he was a good officer. And a cable officer. Not a startling cable officer, but a decent one. This is a more than capable force for a flying squadron. Fire is returned by the French, but this doesn't have significant effect initially. And in an effort to hold off the fast squadron, the first-rate 110-gun Revolutionnaire exchanges places with the smaller third-rates at the rear of the line. And the Revolutionnaire is important because now she will play the critical part on the 28th of May, but after the 28th of May, she has to return to France in a severely damaged state. So they lose one of their first rates. And when we start talking about the orders of battle on the actual 1st of June, the loss of a first rate and another third rate, Audacious goes with her as well, is a big loss. The loss of the 29th of May, and we'll talk about that in a second, is another 2 third rates go home. This is a whittling down of Villard de Joyce's fleet, and more importantly, this is a whittling down of his better ships, of his more trustworthy officers and captains, the ones he can rely on to fight off the British when they are coming at him. And the actual manoeuvre was conducted without the express orders of Villard de Jose or the political observer aboard, Jean Bon Saint-André. It was nice to carry a travel with a political commissar, isn't it? Now, they brought Revolutionnaire to steady action at 1800 hours. Bellerophon taking a lead in this. The ships exchanged fire for 20 minutes, with Bellerophon taking severe damage to her rigging, falling back to be replaced by HMS Marlborough. Marlborough is then joined by Russell and Thunderer, and between them they shoot away Revolutionaire's rigging, so that by 1930 hours she's unmanageable. HMS Leviathan also joined in the action, firing at a vessel which was just ahead of Revolutionnaire. At this point, Howe became concerned that Powsley's squadron might become cut off from the main body of his fleet. The numbers were so great on the French side that he was worried if they did, he could lose a significant part of his force and then face attack on his wider fleet. And again, he knew he wouldn't be able to disengage completely. So Howe recalls them at 2000 hours. Unfortunately, HMS Audacious, under Captain William Parker, which had only just arrived up front, was engaging Revolutionnaire so closely that she could not safely withdraw, and although her gunnery eventually dismasted the Revolutionnaire, Audacious took severe damage. It was not until 2200 hours that they were able to disentangle themselves and limp apart. Now, interesting enough, Audacious's crew claim that Revolutionnaire struck her colours during the engagement. This has never been corroborated. And Parker stated he didn't take possession of Revolutionnaire because he was concerned about the distant sighting of 9 French ships on the horizon. This was a squadron under Commodore Jean-Joseph Castanier, which was not involved in the ongoing campaign and which disappeared without participating in any subsequent engagements. You can imagine if a Royal Navy Commodore had got home and said, "Oh yeah, there looked like there was a massive battle going on." But we were coming home, so I decided to come home. Oh, you actually don't need to imagine. There's actual historical examples of what happens to officers who do that. Talk about career ending. No. I'm not sure about the surrender. I think with enough firepower going on, things get shot away all the time, so flags can fall down. So it can look like you're striking your colours. I'd also say, myself, if Parker had felt there was really a chance that 110 first rate had struck its colours to him, the man was keen enough for victory and honour and glory that he was disobeying Howe's command earlier. I don't think he wouldn't have taken the chance to try and take the ship. He has an ego on him, does Parker. There is a reason he doesn't like Nelson being given the command in things instead of him. He's a bit of a glory hound. If he genuinely thought that ship had struck its colours, and he genuinely thought, therefore, he should take it, he would have taken it. What Howe would have done with it is a completely different matter. Would Howe have crewed it, tried to get it away, or would Howe have burnt it? We know after the main battle he allows the ships to survive, but... You see, up here I've put in sort of what you've got. Rear Admiral Montague wandering around with 9 third rates and 2 frigates, sailing not too far away, but far enough away is not part of the battle. And there's Captain Rainier escorting convoy with 2 third rates, a 4th rate, and 3 frigates and a sloop. Lord Howe's fleet consists of 3 first rates, 4 second rates, 18 third rates, 7 frigates, a sloop, 2 cutters, 2 fireships, and a hospital ship. Revolutionaire and other ships around it suffered so much damage that they had to be sent back to France. In fact, Revolutionaire could have been taken prisoner as well. Also, taken surrender of by HMS Thunderer when Captain Albert Alberti failed to take possession of the dismantled 3-decker when ordered to. During night, Villeray managed to get reinforcements to rescue Revolutionaire, and at dawn, 29th of May, Parker saw that this vessel was supported by an undamaged ship of the line, or the Audacious, and the frigate Boulogne and 2 corvettes. And Audacious was still too close, coming under fire from Revolutionaire, leaving her no option but to flee from this now superior force. Audacious was actually followed the whole way home, and it's always lovely to have Audacious and Audacious involved in the same battle. The French Audacious decided to took Revolutionaire home, and the British Audacious was pursued by the frigate Boulogne and 2 corvettes for half an hour before losing rain squall and eventually returned to Plymouth on the 3rd of June. So managed to miss the battle. Rather annoying. But it happens. It's annoying to Lord Howe because he's had a 3rd rate go home, but in other news, he doesn't have to deal with Parker, who's good, but annoying. On the 29th of May, well, they have more of engagements. Howe continues to pursue the French rear. The British line is placed on attack that was intended to cut through the French line and isolate and capture the ships of the cut to the east of the cut, with HMS Caesar under Captain Anthony Molly, and as you can see, still at the front of Howe's line on the 1st of June, 3rd rate 80 gun, chosen to lead the attack, as the ship was the fastest in the fleet. But it failed, because Molloy seemed to refuse to close with the enemy. Instead, Caesar and HMS Queen opened fire on rearmost French ships from a distance. The vans of the opposing fleet then engaged in a long-range broadside duel from about 1000 hours, which inflicted some damage on both sides, the worst hit being the French Montagnard. Now, Howe has issues with certain officers on his command. And one of those is, well, how do I put this politely? Is Captain Molly. Because again, at 12:30 hours, Howe reissues the order. And once more Caesar's to lead the way. He signals that, without cause, it's argued, that Caesar was unable to attack and then turning and sailing eastwards down the outside of the British fleet, ran towards the enemy. This threw all the rest of the ships into confusion, but luckily HMS Queen is right behind. HMS Queen, of course, is a second rate, which has Rear Admiral Gardner on. And at this point in the battle, Rear Admiral Gardner does definitely have a flag captain. He has a Captain John Hutt aboard. Now, Hutt was a very good officer. And he is actually one of the few officers who's sort of been promoted by Gardner himself and pushed up by Gardner. With Howe and Gardner's both a joint agreement, Gardner had taken him as his flag captain. He was someone who Gardner saw as a version of himself. On the 29th of May, as Queen tries to take over from Caesar, as Queen tries to do the job that Caesar was supposed to, in terms of leading the line, and tries to almost solo, she gets the target of everything the French have got, and John Hutt is mortally wounded. As a result, she passes down the outside of the French line, firing as she goes, unable to effectively manoeuvre because she's been damaged as well as her captain hurt. But Gardner is pulling the fleet together and trying to get this person who was actually a bit of a protege of his actually to work, actually fine. And that's another reason why on the 1st of June he has no flag captain, because for once he'd had a flag captain who he'd actually liked and wanted there, and then he gets hurt. By the way, if anyone's thinking that Captain Anthony Molloy gets a bit of a target on his back at this point by two admirals, one of whom's lost a friend, doesn't quite that, they hope he'll survive but does eventually die, and one of whom has given him orders and he's kept not obeying them, you'd be right. There are a few admirals currently gunning for Molloy at this point. With his plan falling apart, as it so often does, Howe decides that, frankly, he's fed up with letting others lead this, turns Queen Charlotte, his flagship, towards the French line, steers around Caesar, possibly making rude remarks and rude gestures and rude notes on the loud hailer as he's doing so, and leads it himself. Well, attempts to. She first attempts to break through the French line between the 6th and 7th ships from the rear. Unfortunately, she's unable to reach this gap and instead sails between the 5th and 6th. raking the Earl from close range, which was the 6-ship line. Bellerophon and Lord Hugh Seymour in the Leviathan followed close behind the flagship. Both of those vessels basically considered it, how do I put this politely? Thomas Pasley basically turned around to Captain Hope and goes, "We will be next to Queen Charlotte, or we will be blown up. There is no way I am letting it be said Lord Howe goes on his own, because if anything happens to him, then I will be the guy, because I'm the next closest rear admiral, who will get the blame for deserting him. And I don't want to go back to England and tell them Lord Howe is dead, and I wasn't there supporting him. So let's move." He doesn't use that long an explanation. Basically, it's a case of, "Through the French or bust, lads! Through the French!" And they go. As fast as a sailing ship of the line will do so. But he is in a third rate. If you'll notice that the others of all the other animals are sort of in second rates and first rates, and then there's Pasley in his nice third rate. And immediately you go, why? Well, it's quite easy. He's a speed demon, and he wants to go as fast as he can. And a third rate will outpace a second rate, and he wasn't going to get a first rate. Sorry, rear admirals, they rarely get something as nice as a first rate. Both ships attempt to cut between the French ships. Bellerophon does this successfully. Leviathan was prevented by damage to her helm. Yeah. Poor Villa Digisi just doesn't have a good time. And, well, this point, Howe's ships, technically, well, Bellerophon and Queen Charlotte, are isolated. They're raked by Terrible, the Tyrannicide, and Indomitable. Well, no, they are both isolated by and have isolated. It's one of those interesting things. They've formed into a nasty little battle, where at this current point you have 2 ships versus 3, and the rest of the British fleet coming up on them, and the French fleet going away. So technically, the French are, we've got 3 ships versus your 2, which is, nice to have. And the Terrible's on a 110-gun first rate. The Tyrannicide is a 74-gun French ship of the line, and the Indomitable is an 80-gun Tonnant class vessel. So they're all powerful ships. You've got basically a first rate and 2 third rates versus a first rate and a third rate. It's a more than even battle, but the trouble is the rest of the British fleet is coming up, of course, including Gardner, who is getting HMS Queen back under control as fast as he flipping can. Fueled by some combination of rage and indomitable sea spirit at this point. Videra is then helped by Howe, because Howe decides that, frankly, those 3 ships will be dealt with by the rest of the Navy. I'm going to take on the rest of the French squadron. Bellerophon, are you with me? At which point, Pasley was probably going, that old man is going to get me killed. That old man is going to get me killed. Follow him, but he's going to get us all killed. The Terrible is severely damaged, and HMS Orion, Invincible, Barfleur decide to suddenly cut through and back him up, and the Tyrannicide and Indomitable are basically being fired at as the Royal Navy passes them, and Villeray has to fall, or Jose has to wear his fleet around to face Howe. He has to, because otherwise he's going to lose these ships. And also, that crazy old man is coming straight at him. Honestly, he has a choice. At this point, he's fairly certain Queen Charlotte is somehow blessed by some higher being, because that's the only way to explain how that ship is coming straight for him still. Okay? It's literally break the broken line solo. And we're not talking about a quick rejoinder. We're not talking about a few minutes on their own. No. You're talking ages sail pace of battles. They're alone for half an hour, 45 minutes, blasting away quite merrily, 3-1, before they're backed up by Bellerophon. And when Bellerophon gets there, it's basically, we've got reinforcements. Let's go charge at the rest of the fleet. It happens, but Howe is special, Admiral. There aren't many 68-year-olds who will be doing this, but this is why he's awake for 6 days non-stop. Now, here is where the issues with Caesar actually gave Villeray false confidence, because he believed Howe's fleet was more damaged than it appeared. And so all of Villeray de José's fleet ships actually follow him, except the Montagnard, which refused to turn, claiming to be still seriously damaged. The Montagnard is always an interesting issue. And Villeray's manoeuvre does manage to isolate the Queen Charlotte, Bellerophon, and the Leviathan, which had finally managed to get through. Kept plugging through and then gone, hang on, where are you? We're coming! And basically, at this point, someone does manage to persuade Howe that maybe 3 ships versus the entire French fleet is not going to be enough to win. So he does actually withdraw to form up his own fleet, which allows Villeray to save the Indomitable and the Tyrannicide, and attempts to escape westwards. Followed closely, of course, by the British van, who were now, thanks to all this manoeuvring, holding the weather gauge. Which means that whilst Howe hasn't won this skirmish, he's now won the strategic side of this battle. He's gained the weather gauge. Both fleets need to take time to repair each other. In all the action, the British had suffered 67 killed and 128 wounded during the day's fighting. The French, it seems, have suffered more. What Lord Howe doesn't realise is, at the same time as he is attempting to ready himself for what is another day of battle on the 30th of May, over the same sea area as the action they had fought during the 29th, the merchant ships, the convoy was passing, but having managed to evade the British pursuit. Villeray knew this, and he had detached the Montagnard to the convoy. Admiral Neely, who was a captain of the issues that Villeray had been having, leaves his escort duties to reinforce Villeray. Now, this is where the interesting thing comes from, where people go, well, was he in command or not? He's a third rear admiral who shows up. I have a rearguard issue. You're in charge of it. You're the only officer I have, if I'm Villeray de José, to put in charge of it. So he's put in charge of it. Again, you look through this. Howe has options. He has choices. If Molloy, I keep wanting to call him Molloy manages to play around, he has lots of options of senior officers to come and tell him off. Lots of options. And he can do, and will do. It's kind of interesting that on the 1st of June, he puts Bellerophon, which is one of his most trusted ships as the ship right behind Caesar. And that's possibly also because if Caesar had done the same issues on the 1st of June as it did on the 29th, I'm not sure if Gardner might not have ordered his guns to fire on another British ship. He does seem to be suitably annoyed by Caesar's actions, or rather the actions of her captain. It comes close to being an issue at sea. I'm fairly sure if Howe hadn't felt that there was going to be action next day, he would have possibly done something about Molloy that night. At this point, there is other news. HMS Castor, which of course had been captured earlier by Nearly, is retaken by HMS Carrisford, which is actually smaller, in a frigate action on 29th May 1794. And some of the crew are released by the rescuers, but most, including officers, were found not to be aboard. They were still on the Sans Perel, Nearly's flagship. On the 30th of May, Howe sent a signal to all his captains asking if they considered their ships ready for combat. Guess which ship signalled it wasn't? All the rest said, yes, we will go and fight it. This includes Leviathan, includes Queen, which has literally rebuilt itself more of the night, Bellerophon, which was fighting alongside Queen Charlotte, Caesar says, I'm not able to fight today. I'm not sure what Howe's response was, but I think it was something along the lines of tough nuggets. However, he can't engage on the 30th because there's fog. And on the 31st of May, when the fog clears, the French were still within sight and north. And the British are kind of surprised at this point, because none of the 26 ships in the French fleet appeared to show battle damage, whereas the British ships were all nursing damaged rigging and battered hulls. This is because Villeray had managed to reorganize his force. He'd sent the Montagnard and the frigate Seine to the convoy, but gained the Trenton May, which was a third-rate vessel sailing around independently at this point, but purposefully to try and hunt down any enemy vessels which might be preying on their own frigates and attacking their own convoys. And also, Neely's squadron came along with, of course, Neely in the Sans Perel, along with the Trajan and the Temeraire. So, he'd gained a 80-gun third rate. He'd gained a 74-gun vessel. And he gained another 74 and a third 74. So he gained 3 74s and an 80-gun. That's a pretty useful thing again to have, especially as, yes, as I've said possibly 3 times now, the Montagnard and the Serene and other ships have been lost, but you know, he's got new ships in. But Howe had also not been found wanting. Howe had been positioning himself. Howe had given strict orders. There was going to be no repeat of the 29th of May. He didn't want to have a fight until he had... This is one of the reasons he didn't have a fight on the 30th of May, because he didn't want to have a fight until he had a full day in which to conduct it, in order that his signals not be obscured or misinterpreted. And also after he'd had a nice long conversation with probably the officers aboard his ship, but also spread them out around the sort of the various dissemination of communications around the fleet, exactly what he expected of his fleet. Now, as you can see, I've spelled Villeret Jersey both ways. Sometimes he's called Villeret de Jersey, and sometimes he's called Villeret-Jersey. And I've kind of confused in my notes. I use both because I've seen both used, and it gets... Honestly, I've got to standardize my notes. I've got to, because it's confusing me. But anyway, we now get to the 1st of June. And so, Howe was in a favourable position. Yes, look at this fleet. Villeret de Jersey has got 3 first rates, 23 third rates. So, in terms of second rates, the RN has them, the French don't. The French have equal numbers of first rates. But remember, they've lost one of their first rates. They could have had 4. So 4 first rates and 23 third rates versus 3 first rates, 4 second rates, and 18 third rates would have sounded a bit more of a convincing force. Because at this point, whilst yes, you have 23 third rates, they have to face off against 4 second rates and 18 third rates. Now, the difference in firepower is not as big as you might hope in that scenario. Either way. The second rates do not bring enough firepower to equal the French and make up for the difference in numbers. The drop of 5, the missing extra ship that you need to have equality in numbers. Which, if the Audacious had stayed around, they would have, and had the Audacious had followed the orders which Howe was giving, Howe would have had. But that's not to be. In addition to this force, of course, there is Rear Admiral Vassable, who has 2 third rates, 2 frigates and a brig escorting the convoy. Rear Admiral Connick, who has a single first rate, 7 third rates, 2 frigates, a corvette and a cutter, somewhere in the Bay of Biscay. It would have been really useful if he'd been around and had come along. Because of the way the Directorate and the Republic is organised, and because of even Villeret de Jersey here has the representative on mission, Jean Bon Saint-André, this lovely politician with him to check he does what he's supposed to do and doesn't defect to England with his fleet or surrender when he's not supposed to. There are issues going on with the command structure. There are officers in posts who really don't want to be doing the things they're supposed to be doing. Which might make sense having political officers out there, but that actually makes things worse as well. It makes things a lot worse in other ways. Anyway. What happens? Well, the fleets line up. And this is how they line up. And again, Caesar's in front. You have Royal Sovereign, you have Queen Charlotte, and you have Royal George here. Any scenario where you have those vessels lining up is not going to be good for anyone. And then we've considered the officers in them, and you go, well, you know, let's see who's in who. Queen Charlotte, of course, is a good friend. Admiral Lord Howe. Royal Sovereign, first rate, Vice Admiral Thomas Graves, Captain Henry Nichols, and Royal George. That's of course Sir Alexander Hood, Vice Admiral, with Captain William Donnet. And yeah, before we even get into the battle, let's discuss what happens to these particular 3 ships. The Royal Sovereign. Damage to mast and rigging after the battle. The Royal George, lost foremast, damage to remaining masts and rigging. The Queen Charlotte, extensive damage to masts and rigging. Wonder where the French like to aim at ships. Then let's consider the other ships commanded by admirals. HMS Bellerophon, Rear Admiral Thomas Powsley, of course, our friend from the 28th. Extensive damage to masts and rigging. Rear HMS Impregnable, the second rate, under the command of Rear Admiral Benjamin Caldwell and Captain George Blagden Westcott. Damage to masts and rigging. HMS Brunswick. That's a third rate without an admiral aboard, but it seemed appropriate from its damage, but no. Rear HMS Queen, lost main mast, damage to remaining masts and rigging. I think Gardner was on a personal hunt at this point. Then the ships which were damaged as well. There were a fair number of ships which were damaged. You lost... Well, HMS Marlborough was totally dismasted. And that's under a 74 under Captain George Cranfield Berkeley. HMS Defence, another 74 under Captain James Gambier, totally dismasted. HMS Brunswick, third rate. You'll notice where she is, right next to Queen Charlotte. Brunswick, you can see her actual line. She goes for the Vengeur du Peuple. And, well, she really does go for her. Captain John Harvey dies during the battle. Lieutenant William Edward Krakow takes charge. She lost her mizzen mast, extensive damage to the remaining masts and rigging. HMS Orion. Yeah. Captain John Thomas Duckworth, minor damage to masts and rigging. And minor is under Royal Navy terms of minor. And HMS Glory. Second rate, Captain John Elphinstone. The Royal Navy did have a second rate without a rear admiral aboard, but they also had a third rate which had a rear admiral aboard here in this photo. And, well, she had severe damage to masts and rigging. When you look up the totals of wounded and dead, every single ship loses some people. Other than, well... HMS Thunderer somehow managed to escape with 0 people lost, and most of the support ships do. HMS Phaeton loses 8 people wounded and killed, but Thunderer is the only ship of the line which does. Brunswick loses 159. Marlborough 109. And then, I think in third place is HMS Caesar with 67. Yes, Caesar gets into battle. So this is it. This is the 1st of June order of battle. And you can see already there's something interesting going on here, because Howe planned from the beginning not to maneuver the way he was supposed to. He didn't plan on engaging in a line fleet action. He planned on charging straight at the enemy. He was counting, you can argue, on the professionalism of his captains and crews, combined with the advantage of the weather gauge to attack the French directly. I would say what he's also counting on is, in this scenario, there is no ambiguity. All ships turn, all ships charge. There's no chance for a Caesar to get a different idea and decide it's going to go a different way, because it can't. Everyone's going, no one's following anyone else other than the admirals are turning, they're leading, we're following. And if you don't follow, if you don't go with them, then you know what's going to happen as a senior officer in the Royal Navy. You're going to get accused of cowardice, and your life expectancy becomes far shorter. You have a choice. Fight the French, and fight them hard today, do your duty, or you won't see tomorrow. It's not quite Warhammer 40k Imperial Commissar putting a bullet straight through an admiral's head, but it wouldn't be far off, because you would be facing a court-martial of the other captains who you just left behind to go and fight the battle without you. Let's wonder what their judgment might have been. Accusing officer, commander-in-chief. Officer sitting as head of the panel, probably the Vice Admiral Hood or Vice Admiral Graves. Whichever one didn't feel like being the prosecutor. That's not a survival statistic. That's there is a certainty of judgment, so you go for it. So, this was, instead of, basically, instead of doing what Rodney had done at the Battle of Saints 12 years earlier, in that sort of creating a new line straight through his opponent's force and breaking him that way, Howe has, as I said, each of his ships turned individually towards the French. Their purpose was to break, as you can see with this line of judgment, to break every single gap in the line. To break up the line completely. And raking French ships at bow and stern, which was their weakest points, remember? It's the same calculation Nelson makes. The British would then pull up the leeward side of their opposite numbers and cut them off from retreating downwind, engaging them directly and hopefully forcing all of them to surrender, because why aim for just a few ships when you can take out the entire fleet? At this point, if you're noticing Sans Perel is there and you're going, okay, that's not good for that ship. It's not good for pretty much any ship in that fleet. Aeol, maybe. Trajan, possibly. America, Temeraire, all, to an extent, should be okay, but they're not going to be that okay. Within, well, as quickly as the signal is issued, Queen Charlotte starts turning. And Howe's plan sort of falters, where some of the British captains misunderstood or ignored the signal and were hanging back in the original line. This is even with the issues I've talked about. They are facing it. Other ships were still struggling with damage from the earlier engagements. That's what they would claim, and could not get into action fast enough. The result is it becomes a sort of ragged formation tipped by Queen Charlotte that heads unevenly for Villeroy's fleet. But also, to be honest, that's the best you can expect. That is the best you can expect. And in a dream world, Howe would make the signal and everyone would turn. But a lot of these captains have spent their life thinking about fighting in line. And yes, there's the threat of cowardice, but they can claim, we don't know. And maybe if just the Admiral goes and the others don't go. But the more that start to go, you start to realise, hang on, we're not going to be able to play this. And of course, there's some of the captains who really do want to go, who have the issues. As said, their ships are struggling. Their ships are in. It takes them time to wear round, so they're not going to wear round immediately. They're going to have to work themselves with the damage of the ship, so they're taking time anyway. And as slowly you get the whole fleet going forward. And you can get the whole fleet forward, because despite Queen Charlotte really, really putting on the sail, it was actually one of Admiral Graves' vessels in the van, HMS Defence, under Captain James Gambier, nicknamed Dismal Jimmy by his contemporaries, in some sources it seems, because he was so dour. But, well, he goes on to become an admiral of the fleet, and is certainly a very capable officer. It's also, his is the 7th ship in the line, as you can see. His is the first to successfully cut the French line, going between the Mucius and the Tourville. You can see the line on this drawing. Within minutes of him doing this, Berkeley, that's George Cranfield Berkeley, in HMS Marlborough, executed Howe's manoeuvre as he dreamed of it, raking the Imperatrice and the Mucius, and then managing to tangle with the Impetuous and boarding her. The rest of the man has mixed success. Bellerophon and Leviathan, they have the excuse of they got severely beaten up yet the day on the 29th, assisting Queen Charlotte. You know, in a nice way, they've had already been beaten up. But they're in there. They are. And there's this great painting of Howe and his officers on his flagship as he's, you know, engaging the French and the decision he's making. I have got extra slides in for the recorded video on the 1st of June. Because there's going to be a lot more on the 1st of June. That's going to be a lot longer. I thought all the slides should still be in for the recorded video. For live on the 1st of June, I mean. Sorry. Now, Bellerophon and Leviathan, they pull along Eo and America, respectively, and bring them into gunnery duels instead of trying to break the line, because they just can't do it. Parsley on Bellerophon is an early casualty. He loses a leg in the opening exchange. Royal Sovereign, that's Graves' flagship, had issues because she miscalculated the distance. That resulted in her pulling up too far from French line and coming under fire from the Terrible. And it took time for her to get close enough to the Terrible to engage her more closely, during which Royal Sovereign suffered a pounding. A very bloody pounding, excuse the French. And Admiral Graves himself is badly wounded. But she continues on fighting. Russell and Caesar are also cause issues. Russell's captain, John Willett Payne, just didn't really get to grips with her opponent Temeraire, and allowed Temeraire to damage her rigging in the early stages. Some people have put debts down to the damage she received on 29th of May for her poor start to the action, but this was not good. This was not what she was supposed to do, and other ships which had worse damage on 29th of May had managed to repair themselves, so, and were also just as hard pressed getting in there. So I think myself it's easy sitting here to criticize people. It always is, and I always have to be. I always try to remind myself and be careful. It's criticizing them in hindsight, and I'm not taking that personal risk at that time. But I'd say Payne, from some of the sources I read, I think he used up his bank of courage. I subscribe to the school that everyone has their own account of courage, their own bank account of courage. And everyone has differing accounts and differing levels. And good things help you build up that account. But bad things cause withdrawal. And drain you of necessary courage. It's not just courage of physical things, but it's taking a leap into the unknown. It's taking a risk. Any of those things, that all requires withdrawals from the bank of courage. Standing up and saying when you disagree with something, that requires withdrawals from the bank of courage. And this is my historian's view. I'm not a psychologist, this is a historian's view. I think he was reaching very low in his account that day, because he is a brave officer and he has fought previously very well. However, Molloy of Caesar, well, completely ignored Howe's signal, continued ahead as if the battle line was following him rather than engaging the French fleet directly, and it did get involved in a small fight with Trajan, but her fire had little effect, and actually Trajan inflicted more damage to Caesar's rigging, and was subsequently able to concentrate her fire on Bellerophon as well. Roaming unchecked is the phrase that comes up in certain scenarios, through the melee, developing at the head of the line, with Caesar not doing anything about it. That's the van. Now, the centre of the British fleet performs differently. It's sort of divided into two, with Caldwell and Boyer in charge of the sort of forward section, and the rear section under Lord Howe directly. Howe, in Queen Charlotte, engaged the French as close as he could. Caldwell and Boyer were slightly less active, is what we'll phrase it as. They closed the division, the French, in line ahead formation, and chose to engage in a long distance duel, which meant their opponents were able to harass the defence just ahead of them, and, well, this is where there are issues in their own command, because Captain Thomas Pakenham, in charge of HMS Invincible, decides that frankly he's fed up with sticking away and he's going to follow his admiral in. And so he gets as close as he can do. He's badly damaged by a lone charge, but manages to engage the Juste, the much larger vessel, very closely. And then Boyer, who unfortunately had lost a leg in the opening exchanges and was possibly the slightly more aggressive of the two, his ship, the Barfleur, comes up once he's having lost, he's no longer present, and supports Invincible. So Barfleur and Invincible are engaging the Juste. And the Juste, of course, is one of the 80-gun ships of the line. So again, it's one of those things, is the French have a lot of 80-gun third rates wandering around, which is another reason why I say it's far it's interesting, the disparity. Whilst HMS Brunswick had initially struggled to join the action, John Harvey actually received a rebuke from Howe for his delay, and the movement on. Once he received that signal, Harvey seems to push his ship forward and almost managed to outstrip Queen Charlotte, blocking her view of the eastern half of the French fleet for a time and taking severe damage as she does so, protecting the Queen Charlotte as she goes in. Harvey, it seems, had aimed to run aboard Jacobin and support his admiral directly, but unfortunately not fast enough to reach her, and so instead he cuts between the Achille and the Vengeur de Pupille. This failed when Brunswick's anchors become entangled in the Vengeur's rigging. At which point, the ship's master turns round to Harvey and goes, "Shall we cut her loose?" At which point Captain Harvey responds, in one of the best lines ever said in battle, "No, we have got her and we will keep her. This is an enemy ship you're fighting. You have just randomly tangled in it, without it being your target, but a fish in the hand is worth two in the sea, and so you'll take it. The two ships swung so close to each other that the Brunswick's crews could not open their gun ports and had to fire through the closed lids. Think about that, they had to fire through their own lids to fire at the enemy ship because they were so close they couldn't open them. The phrase sometimes people go is that it was a few feet. No, in the nicest way, if you're close enough you can't open the port. You're not a few feet away from each other. You're a few inches. Other ships of the division behind this did strike the French line, and HMS Valiant under Thomas Pringle decided to pass close to Patriot, which pulled away. The crew were apparently suffering from a terrible contagion and unable to take their ship into battle. So Valiant decided that she would instead fight the Achille, which had all been raked already by Queen Charlotte and Brunswick, and was badly damaged. But Valiant couldn't stay with her for long, because he looked ahead, Pringle looked ahead, and saw that the Van Division were having issues. And so HMS Ryan under Thomas Duckworth, John Thomas Duckworth, and of course HMS Queen, with Alan Gardner aboard. Lovely when that admiral's around, you know something interesting is going to happen. Both attacked the same ship. Queen, Queen was still suffering from her earlier damage, but both ships bore down on the now French Northumberland, which was soon dismasted, and was then left attempting to escape on only a stump of a mast, while Queen, decided to fall with Gemeps, and decided to batter her, a Temeraire Class 74, to, basically to pieces. Well, they try and batter each other to pieces, really. The rear is just as interesting. The rear, of course, has Admiral Hood with it. And Admiral Hood might have been more emphatic with his officers about exactly what would happen if they didn't engage more closely behind Howe. Possibly, who knows what he'd suggested he was going to do to them, but it is understood that Hood had been very emphatic that they were going to be following orders when Howe gave them. And this is Hood, who likes to rewrite orders when he feels the need to, but he liked Howe's orders. And so HMS Royal George decides to pierce between the Republican and the Sans Pareil. The Sans Pareil had been the flagship of Neely, but Neely was now aboard the Republican, and so he basically pierces Neely's heart in two, engaging both closely, because again this is Hood, and Hood doesn't understand the concept of there's a first rate and a third rate which are going to be fighting me. I will be outgunned by this. No! I'm Hood. Their dinner. HMS Glory comes through the line behind Sans Pareil and throws herself into the melee as well to try and support the Royal George. Basically going, why? Okay, Admiral, we're here to help you. And the rest, the British and French rearguard, well, HMS Montague decides to fight a long-range gunnery duel Neptune, which damaged neither ship severely. But and what's really interesting is the commander of HMS Montague is a Captain James Montague, who is killed in the opening exchanges. and command devolves to Lieutenant Rostono. So we can't really be quite sure, because of course the Lieutenant is taking over and is commanding a ship and is trying his best, but hasn't received the same orders and instructions necessary as his captain has. HMS Ramillies ignored her opponent completely and sailed west, with Captain Henry Harvey basically going, she is no threat to anyone. None at all. However, my brother is Captain John Harvey on Brunswick, and I can see that she's in severe damage. So I am sailing to her. Of course, his brother dies in the battle, but he goes and joins the action around Queen Charlotte. HMS Alfred engaged the French line extreme range with no notable effect. HMS Majestic, well, Captain Cotton, Charles Cotton, managed to earn everyone's annoyance because he seems to have done little in the until the action was decided, at which point he decided to take the surrender of several already shattered French ships. That was not really considered playing cricket. And then HMS Fundra, under Albemarle Bertie, this basically doesn't do much. She has the signal for close engagement hanging from her main mast, and she's actually standing well away from the British line. Thankfully, she made the case, and Albemarle certainly made the case, that he was holding off in case the French rear ships did something. He was trying to block them, because the Entremont and Pellier didn't do anything. The French rear ship Scipion didn't attempt to join the action, but unfortunately managed to get caught up in the group around the Royal George and the Republican, and suffered severe damage because she came within range of Hood. At this point, the battle has become a general melee, and it is an absolute slaughter going on. If you can imagine, when you have, yes, not all ships on all sides are engaged, but probably about 40 ships in total are blasting each other out at close range, and we're talking distances from less than 100 yards to about 6 or so inches, there is a lot of firepower going on. And there is a problem for the French, because they have a habit of firing into the rigging. Yeah, that is a great decision to make. It's not great to make when you find yourself fighting the British at close range, because when you start to look at the French casualties, you're talking 200, 300 on some of their ships, 400 nearly on the Sans Perel. Sans Perel loses 380 killed and wounded. On many of the French ships, it's unknown how many were lost, but we know they lost a lot more. The Vengier de Purple loses 200 in action, 600 get lost when she sinks after the battle. Caesar finally attempts to join the fight, only to have a spar shot away by Trajan, which caused her to slip down the two embattled fleets without contributing to the battle. After about an hour of the fight actually going on, Bellerophon and Leviathan were in such thick action that the Bellerophon was taking damage all over the place. This left her unable to maneuver. I think we'll go back and carry on. And the Earl of the French fleet was also suffering severely. Captain Hope was trying to extract his ship from a position which he felt was unlikely to be survivable, and called upon the frigate HMS Latonia under Captain Edward Farnborough to provide assistance. Now, at this point, Farnborough brings his ship between the ships of the French battle line, opens fire on the Earl, which is always a bad decision for a frigate to do, because that means you are now able to be targeted without any disregard to a dishonour by a flagship and by a ship of the line, and then tows Bellerophon to safety. Leviathan, and actually she helps them drive off 3 ships of the line doing it. Yeah, a little frigate pulls it out and actually does it successfully. And one of the interesting things about HMS Latonia is when you look at the list, she doesn't get anyone killed or wounded during this action. She does it completely. She's firing on ships and no one's firing back at her because they're seeing so much fire coming from the big ships. No one notices what the frigate's doing, even when it's towing out Bellerophon. Leviathan, under Captain Seymour, was more successful, and her gunnery managed to dismast America, despite receiving fire also from the Earl and Trajan in passing. And she actually left the America after a 2-hour duel, deciding that Queen Charlotte in the centre needed support again. Yeah, it's basically everyone's going, hang on, Queen Charlotte needs support. Oh, good lord, we can't lose how. Now, the Russell hadn't broken the French line, and her opponent Temeraire got the better of her, knocking her topmast away and managing to escape to windward with Trajan and Earl. But Russell then decided to fire at several French ships in passing before joining Leviathan to reinforce Queen Charlotte. Russell's boats take the surrender of America, her crew boarding the vessel and making her a prize, although they are later replaced by crew from the Royal Sovereign. At this point, Admiral Graves is pretty much no more. He's no longer part of the fleet that's fighting. He is seriously injured and away from action, so it's all down to her captain from this point onwards in the Royal Sovereign. Terry, her opponent, falls out of line to windward and joins the French ships forming a line on the far side of the action. And Villeray was leading the line in his flagship Montaigne, which had managed to escape from the Queen Charlotte. And so the Royal Sovereign, because they know what Graves wanted them to do, decided that they would go and engage the Montaigne, pursuing her close to the French line, accompanied by the Valiant, and beginning a long-range action with this to stop them coming back and trying to reform the fight going on around the Queen Charlotte and other things. Behind Royal Sovereign was Marlborough, tangled with the Impetus. Impetus was on the verge of surrender when the Mucius appeared through the smoke and collided with both ships. Now, the 3 ships continued exchanging fire for some time, suffering heavy casualties all round, and Marlborough and Impetus lost their masts. In fact, this combat goes on for hours, and Captain Berkeley out of Marlborough retires below because of serious wounds, and John Monckton, then a lieutenant, future a rear admiral, takes charge, signals for help from the reserve. HMS Aquarium was assisting in repeating the signals, towed Marlborough out of line as Mucius freed herself, French fleet north. Impetus was in too damaged a state to move at all, and so HMS Russell's sailors arrived. Isn't that fun? They're just coming along, just taking ships where they need to. The dismasted by this point, and so was various opponents to a protracted duel, and by 1300 hours was actually threatened by the damaged Republican. And, of course, Nearly, who was basically going, I will fight! Luckily, the Republican is basically cooled off, but Gambia does request support from a ship from the fleet's frigates as well, and HMS Phaeton, under the command of Captain William Betnick, comes in. As Impetus passed, she actually fired on the Phaeton, because she hadn't been taken surrender of, and Betnick responded with several broadsides of his own. Invincible, the only ship of the forward division in the British centre to engage the enemy closely, also went to help Queen Charlotte, and Invincible's guns managed to fire on Juiced so much that they pushed her onto the broadside of Queen Charlotte, where she was forced to surrender to Lieutenant Henry Blackwood in a boat from Invincible. Probably sensible, because at a certain point Howe was considering leading a boarding action, and that would just have been worrying. Now, Queen Charlotte and Montagne have a very interesting fight going on between them. The French flagship decides to not use her lower deck guns, and consequently, Queen Charlotte manages to really beat the out of her. Now, the reason she might not have been using her lower deck guns was because she was already quite low in the water, and opening them could well have seen her perform a Mary Rose. So that is my theory as to why she wasn't using her lower deck guns. However, Queen Charlotte was so damaged by the ships that she was nearby that she was unable to follow the Montagne when she set her remaining sails and slipped to the north to create the withdrawal point for the French fleet. Queen Charlotte took fire during the engagement from HMS Gibraltar as well at one point. He had failed to close the enemy, and instead fired at random into the smoke surrounding the flagship, thinking he was hitting the enemy, and actually hitting his own flagship. This didn't at all endear him to Howe. At this point is also when Sir Andrew Snape Douglas, one of the captains aboard the Queen Charlotte, is seriously wounded. With Montagne gone, and beyond range, well, Queen Charlotte decides to go and take on Jacobin and Republican as they passed, and helps force the surrender of Just, as said earlier. To the east of this action, Brunswick and Venger de Purple, how do I put this politely? They were having a death match. That's the only way to describe it. Those two were locked in a combat and were basically just killing each other. Brunswick's Captain Harvey had been mortally wounded by Lagrange fire from Venger, and for those who don't know what that means, Lagrange fire is bags of basically any scrap you can get, because often it's used when you're running out of cannon shot. So it's bits and bobs, scrap, metal, rocks, old musket balls, anything. You fire to injure enemy crews. It's an anti-personnel system. And that's what they were firing. Also, you have to be very close for that to actually be effective. But Harvey refused to quit the deck, ordering the fire to continue upon his opponent. And remember, this is the man whose brother is searching for him to try and come to his aid, because he's seen he's gone into the middle of action. As we all know, and as I said earlier, he will die in action. But his brother's trying to get to him. And that's... How there's not been a movie made about those two brothers, I do not know. Because one literally going, you guys aren't worth fighting, my brother's in the middle of that storm, let's sail my ship there. It's terrible from a command structure point of view, but from an emotive storytelling point of view, imagine that. Now, during this time, Brunswick also managed to drive the Achille off when she tried to intervene. In fact, the Achille was totally dismasted in the exchange and briefly surrendered. Her crew rescinded that when they realised that Brunswick was in no position to take possession. She therefore made sail and attempted to join Villeray in the north. It was not until 12:45 hours that the Venger and Brunswick pulled apart, both dismasted and battered. Brunswick was only able to return to the British side, being supported by Ramillies, while Venger was unable to move at all. Ramillies took Venger's surrender. And of course, Ramillies is the brother. If Ramillies hadn't turned up, the Venger wouldn't have been successful. If Henry Harvey hadn't come to save his brother, we might have lost Brunswick that day. We lost his brother, but Ramillies came to save her. Ramillies found her. Ramillies took Venger's surrender after a brief carronade, unable to board her, and instead pursued the fleeing Achille, which soon surrendered as well to her. To the east, Orion and Queen, because let's be honest, was Gardner going to accept anything less, managed to force the surrender of both Northumberland and Jemappes. Queen was unable to secure Jemappes, and she had to be abandoned later, but because of losses to personnel. And Queen herself was really badly damaged. As I already mentioned earlier, had lost a mainmast, damaged the remaining mast and rigging. She's unable to make the British lines again, wallowing between the French line and the British line, along with other damaged ships in the middle. Royal George and Glory had disabled Scipion, sans Perel, and were also too badly damaged themselves to take possession, but those four ships were also left drifting in the gap between the two fleets. Now, Villeray de Jussy has managed to gather 11 ships of the line around him, and forms them up to reconstitute a battle squadron. At 11:30 hours, when the action is drawing to a close, he begins to try a recovery maneuver intended to lessen the defeat he'd suffered, the tactical defeat he'd suffered, aiming his new squadron at HMS Queen. This caused issues. Howe worked this out quite quickly, pulled his ships together to create a new force. His reformed squadron consisted of Queen Charlotte, Royal Sovereign, Valiant, Leviathan, Barfleur, and Thunder. This is not going to be good for anyone, and let's be honest, Thunder is not going to get the keeper sticking on the sidelines. And Howe deploys this squadron in defence of Queen, and the two short lines engage each other at a distance, before Villeray abandons the manoeuvre. So Villeray has 11 ships. They are against 6. They should be able to overwhelm and push past them. Villeray decides not to. They're in that damaged state still. Howe then starts to work out how to put his force back together in full. And de Jesuit starts hauling off to try and collect his own dismasted ships that were endeavouring to escape the British pursuit. He's subsequently joined by the Terrebelle, which sailed straight through the British fleet to reach the French lines. But he also managed to recover the Scipion, the Mucius, the Gemaps, and the Republican, all of which lay within reach of the unengaged British ships. But Howe just hadn't been able to get the crews there to take them, before turning towards France. Finally, Howe retires below, and his captain of the fleet, Sir Roger Curtis, takes command of the consolidation. Now, at this point, Curtis gets blamed by some in the Navy for not capturing more dismasted French ships, and is even accused of dissuading Howe from attempting further pursuit. But honestly, Curtis was looking around him going, "We're shattered! We have fought a battle to the nth against the French fleet as good as they ever were, in terms of individual ships, and we are still alive." The British fleet only had 11 ships still capable of battle to the French 12, and let's be honest, most of the ships several of the ships still capable of battle were the ones where Howe and Curtis had strong questions about the captains of. One of them was the Caesar. The British ships, therefore, and the crews start making repairs and securing their prizes. The Venger de Purple had been holed by cannon from the Brunswick directly through the ship's bottom. And after a surrender, no British ship had managed to get crew aboard. This meant the Venger's remaining unwounded crew were trying to attempt to salvage what they could. And it's made worse when we know the crew, some of them decide to break into the liquid refreshment store, let's say, the spirits and other good liquor, and became progressively drunk. Not as drunk as we would probably understand it, because let's be honest, they're still sailors. They do live off a life of alcohol, so their tolerance is a little bit higher than probably ours would be. Ultimately, the ship's pumps became unmanageable, and she began to sink. It was the arrival of boats from HMS Alfred, HMS Culloden, as well as the cutter from HMS Rattler, which saved some Venger's crew from drowning. They took off nearly 500 sailors between them. In fact, one of the officers, Lieutenant John Wine of the Rattler, was commended for this work and his actions in this work. By 1815 hours, Venger was beyond salvage, and only the very worst, the wounded, dead, and the drunk remained aboard. Some sailors were apparently waving the tricolour from the bow of the ship and cried, "Vive la nation, vive la Republic," as she went down. Villeray de José escapes to the east and tries to return as best he can to France, dispatching frigates to search for the convoy. He was also hoping for Admiral Pierre-François Connick to reinforce him. They were patrolling near the Ushant headland. Behind him to the west, the British took the whole night to secure their ships and prizes, but they set out for Britain on the 2nd of June. We have a problem understanding the scale of the French losses, because only the Scipion makes actual proper reports of the French captains. The rest are all completely incomplete. And The records made by British officers aboard captured ships cannot really be treated as completely reliable. Most, therefore, of the judgments and the books you read puts the French casualties at around 7,000, including roughly 3,000 captured. British casualties are actually easier to confirm. They are. And whilst there are some discrepancies, generally it's given to roughly about 1,200. And so that leads us to this. The battle. The summary of the battle. Howe tries to resume his search for the French convoy, even with his fleet no longer serviceable. The Admiralty learnt, thanks to the arrival of HMS Audacious in Portsmouth, that the battle had taken place, and Montague had actually managed to return to England. Howe didn't realise this, and so they were preparing a second expedition under Montague to go and support Howe or to try and intercept the convoy. Montague reached sea on the 3rd of June, and by 8th of June was off Ushant, searching for signs of either the French or Howe. He was early. On the 8th of June, he spots sails, and he finds he's found Corneck's squadron, which was also patrolling for the convoy and the returning fleets. Montague gives chase, and Corneck is driven into Bethany Bay, where he's blockaded overnight, hoping to bring them to action the following day. But on the 9th of June, Montague sighted Villeret de Juss's fleet. 19 French ships sailing towards him. And so he turns his ships south to avoid becoming trapped between the two forces, which would have overwhelmed him. It's enough of a disparity he's able to justify it. But it's also a situation where he can tell they're warships and it's not the convoy. For Howe, with Villeret de Jussy and Corneck pursuing Montague to the south, Howe is free to pass Ushant without difficulty and arrives off Plymouth on the 12th of June. And is soon joined by Montague, who managed to outsail both his French pursuers. One of the interesting things is that Villeret de Jussy actually gets home first, theoretically, but his lovely political officer aboard decides to go, no, we can't enter Brest until the attitudes of the town's population have been assessed whether they are Republican enough. And on the 12th of June, the convoy from America, what they'd been fighting over, finally arrived off France, having lost just one ship in passage during a storm. So that's what they've been fighting over, and they've lost a single ship. It could be worse. It could be worse. It was a hard-fought battle. And honestly, as much as we remember it in glory, you have to also remember that there is issues afterwards. Whilst Howe was already an admiral and he refused any further elevation, one of the people who don't like him politically dissuade George III from making him a Knight of the Garter as a response for it. Graves is elevated to the Peerage of Ireland, and I'm not sure why, on what grounds. Oh, it wasn't a glorious enough victory. Outnumbered, they've just won a fight. They captured 6, and one other was blown up, and they didn't lose any. I'd say that's pretty good. Graves is given a Peerage of Ireland as Baron Graves, and Hood is made Viscount Bridport. Boyer, Gardner, Powsley, and Curtis are all made baronets. Boyer and Powsley received pensions of £1,000 a year to compensate for their severe wounds. That's not bad at that time. Let's be honest, £1,000 in 1794 a year, that's a good income. All first lieutenants were promoted to commander. And the joys go down. There is a memorial made to Captain John Hutt and John Harvey, who both had died of their wounds on the 30th of June, and it's raised in Westminster Abbey, and you can see it to this day. There was some dispute over all these wards. And this dispute is that Howe had put a list attached to his report containing names of officers whom he believed merited special reward for their part in the battle, including, of course, Vice Admirals Graves, Hood, Boyer, the Rear Admirals, Boyer, Gardner, Parsley, Captain Seymour, Pakenham, Cranfield, Berkeley, Gambier, John Harvey, Payne, Henry Harvey, Pringle, Duckworth, Elphiston, Nichols, and Hope. Also mentioned specifically Lieutenants Monckton and Donnelly. Many people were upset about being not involved in this. Caldwell was the sole, of course, British flag officer present not to receive a hereditary honour, although he was promoted to Vice Admiral, as were Boyer and Gardner. They decided to award a medal to, well, the Admiralty. After studying the ship's logs and reports of the battle, the Admiralty entered a medal to be awarded to the living captains on the list only. Although Parker of HMS Audacious was awarded one as well, which seemed a bit strange, as he wasn't actually there for the 1st of June. The captains excluded from the list were, of course, furious. Vice Admiral Caldwell quits the service in anger as a result. Cuthbert Collingwood, flag captain of the Barfleur, refuses all awards for future service until the Glorious 1st of June medal was presented to him as well. Eventually received it after the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1797. And 5 decades later, the battle was among the actions recognised by a clasp, which was attached to the Naval General Service Medal, which could be awarded upon all application to all British participants still living in 1847. One of the battles. One of the actions. Now, Molloy of HMS Caesar would claim it was the bitterest suffering and the terrible suffering because of a whispering campaign directed against him, which is probably the nicest action that could have been done, because honestly I'm fairly certain a fair number of the admirals and quite a lot of captains would have quite liked to have court-martialed him. In fact, they do things worse. They accuse him of cowardice because of his failure to follow our orders on both the 29th and 30th of June, and his request for a court-martial to clear his name is failed. His professional ability, the Admiralty actually dismiss him from his ship by saying, "We are not going to call into question your personal courage, but we are calling into question your professional ability." Which is worse? Which is a lot worse. Now, the legacy was, in many ways, it further enshrined the idea you have to fight in the Royal Navy. Yes, the French had got the convoy through, and this is to an extent where they start to get their strategic idea of manoeuvre, the war manoeuvre, that what matters in HL is you complete the operation, you get the convoy through, not if you fight a battle of the British. What the British start to realise is, yeah, they got that convoy through, but they didn't get any more because, hang on, we blockaded them up in port. That worked. We're going to do this. And that's the world. It sets the tone for a lot of the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. And whilst there will be moments during the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolutionary Wars where the Royal Navy will be in a severe low ebb. Not the lowest ebb they ever get to in age of sail, but pretty darn low. They will always have the confidence of this battle behind them. The 1st of June is a rallying cry before Trafalgar ever is. It's called the Glorious 1st of June because it is an absolutely bitter battle, and as is usual, the more bitter and more nasty the battle, the more they give it an impassioned, lovely name of joyous fun. Glorious! Yes. A battle which at points can be best described as a death match. Anyway. So, what is today's question? Because I always put a question at the end of these videos. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to everyone for their support of the channel. It's really, really matters a lot to me. And the question is, I would like you, if you have the time, to go through the order of battle. And I have a little theory about where the Royal Navy was getting their names for dreadnoughts from. And if you go through the 1st of June, and if you go through the Battle of Trafalgar, and another battle, I'm not going to name which one, you'll notice that certain names, which turn up in all 3 of those battles, and the question is going to be, can you figure out which is the 3rd battle, seem to get picked quite heavily to become the names of vessels which are picked as dreadnoughts. Which I think would have pleased... Where's this book? I have it around me there. Julian Corbett, because he was a great student of Howe. He felt he was an admiral who wasn't as properly understood as he should be. He was a very good officer. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and take care. Right then, so this comes out on the 3rd of June. On the 6th of June, you've got the Fleet of the Imperium, Warhammer 40k. Oh, good lord, I hope I've recorded it in time and it's all good. Take care, everyone, and have fun.